My name is Melanie Shapiro. I'm an immigration attorney based in the Boston area. My office is in Norwood, Massachusetts. I've been practicing almost 10 years now, and I've had the pleasure of working with many Ugandans. It might be my largest group of people. I represent people from over 60 countries, and I specialize in asylum, humanitarian relief, removal defense, and appeals. I'm really happy to be here with everyone today.
What is this one thing you want to let our community, know when they come here? We have this narrative as immigrants that we come to this land and there's no manual, there's no script.
I guess I could tie it to my mission at my firm is holistic, compassionate lawyering. And I think another panelist mentioned a holistic approach. And I think that's what has to happen here. When someone's coming to the US from Uganda, particularly if you don't know anyone, if you don't have resources, if you're fleeing violence or persecution or difficult situations, it's important to be able to connect. And I've heard a lot of stories from my clients who have come here and not known anybody and were able to find someone online or through the kindness of strangers that they've encountered, be able to find somewhere to sleep or what have you. So I think that, I believe it was Michael, you were talking about this app that you're putting together of the resources, and I'm excited to hear more about that. But I think there's primarily the legal resources are really important. A lot of cities have offices of refugee resettlement, and I know that that's something that a lot of my clients didn't know about, so that you could get some basic assistance with food or referrals to social workers or counselors or doctors and or lawyers. And all of the immigration courts in the United States have lists of pro bono immigration attorneys. So that might be a good place to start. But I think knowing what your status is and what you might be able to do if you might be eligible for something is a great first step. Now, so I'm going to try and be very efficient in going through the asylum process. So there's two types of asylum. There's affirmative asylum and defensive asylum. Affirmative asylum means that you are filing your case with the asylum office affirmatively on your own. You're not in immigration proceedings already. Defensive means that you're already in immigration court for whatever reason, and you're filing it as a defense to deportation. So I'm going to start with the affirmative process with the asylum office. The way that it works is that you prepare your application, you submit it to the office, and you wait for an interview. Now, in order to be eligible for asylum, there are certain things that you have to show. You have to show that you were persecuted, meaning you were harmed in some way that's pretty grave in your country of origin based on who you are. Now, there are 5 types of bases for why you were harmed because of who you are, and those are race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. And you have to show that the harm you suffered and who you are is tied together. This is called the nexus. So it's the connection between the two things. And a lot of times with Ugandan cases, I have done them based on political opinion. Somebody's FDC, people power movement opposing the current regime, LGBT cases, and domestic violence cases. Those are the 3 main cases that I have for asylum seekers from Uganda. In addition to showing this connection between the harm you suffered and who you are, you also have to show that you are afraid that you're going to be harmed in the future. So if you've already shown past persecution, then it makes it so that we're assuming that you're afraid of persecution in the future. Or if you haven't shown that you've been persecuted in the past, then you have to show that you're afraid of being persecuted in the future. For example, someone comes to the United States and they're LGBT, but they're not out to their family. And while they're here in the US, they do come out, whether they want to or whether they don't, then people back home know that they're LGBT. So even though they haven't been harmed in the past, they now fear that they're going to be harmed in the future. So that's an example there. And then importantly, you have to show that the government is unwilling or unable to help you. So for example, in Uganda, it is against the law to be LGBT. So you have an example there where the government is going to persecute you, is going to harm you because of who you are. That you might get put in jail, you might get taken to a safe house. You know, there's a number of scenarios there. An example of the government being unwilling to help you is if somebody is coming at you through mob justice and the police aren't going to help you. They're just going to let it happen. So if the police aren't arresting you, but someone else is persecuting you in the community through mob justice and the government won't help you, that's an example of the government being unwilling to help you. So just to break it down, it's that you've suffered harm in the past or you have a fear of harm in the future, that it's because of who you are, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, and that the government is unwilling or unable to help you, you can't return to your country. Now, generally, the law says that you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of arriving in the United States. But there are certain exceptions that I've been successful with. For example, if someone has suffered substantial mental injury, for example, like if you're so traumatized from what you've happened that you have a mental health condition such as depression or post-traumatic stress disorder that has caused you to delay in filing your case because you couldn't deal with what has happened to you, then that is a ground to overcome this 1 year filing deadline. Or another one is if you have been in legal status, but you're about to lose your legal status and have to go back, then that being in the legal status and then filing within a reasonable period of time after the 1 year when it's going to be up, that's another exception. So yeah, generally you have to apply within 1 year, but there can be some exceptions to it. And let's see. So I'll just walk you through what the interview situation is like. So after you file your application, you get assigned an alien registration number, an A number, and then you also get a receipt notice with a receipt number for your case that will follow you throughout your whole process. And you do biometrics, which are fingerprints and photos. You wait, and eventually you get called for an asylum interview. When you go for the asylum interview, you check in, and then the whole process is going to be in an office with an officer who asks you questions about your application, your biographical information, why you're afraid to go back, what evidence do you have, what happened to you, and why do you think it happened to you? So that can be anywhere from, I've had them be 1 hour, I've had them be 6 hours. So it really depends on the officer you get and the specifics of your case. Now, there are a couple of things that could happen after your interview. You won't get a decision that day, but you will receive it either in the mail or you have to show up in person and collect your decision. It depends on the office. And it will either be your case is approved, great. Your case is recommended for approval, but it needs a supervisor to review it, or your case is being referred. And even though they say don't call it a denial, it's basically a denial at the asylum office and it's being referred to the immigration court. If your case is approved at the asylum office, then you're able to apply for a refugee travel document. You're also able to file, it's a follow to joint benefit petition. So you can send a request to have your family members, your children under 21 and your spouse in Uganda go through processing at the US Embassy and enter as asylees. An asylee is the word that means that someone who has been granted asylum status. So this is different from refugees, who are people who are granted refugee status are outside of the United States, and asylees are inside the United States. So basically, you get granted, you can bring your family over. After 1 year, you can apply for a green card. And then 4 years later, you can apply to become a citizen. So that's if you're approved. If your case is referred to the immigration court, you're going to be sent a letter saying that, and also with something called a notice to appear, which is basically the document that says, you know, we're putting you to immigration court proceedings, and it's for the following bases. And generally it'll be something like, you're not a citizen or national of the United States, you're a citizen and national of Uganda, you entered on whatever date with whatever status, and because of this reason, like you overstayed your visa, or for some other reason, you could get, you are removable from the United States. And the term is removable. It used to be deportable, but the laws have changed a bit. So now when you hear about removal proceedings, it's kind of synonymous with being in the process of being deported. But anyway, so your case gets sent to the immigration court, and the first thing that you're going to have is called a master calendar hearing, which is basically a pretrial. And you can answer on something called pleadings. Those are answers to what they're listing out in the notice to appear, the charges of removability. And you could say, yeah, these things are true, but I'm applying for asylum. And so you get a second opportunity to have your case heard before the immigration judge. And the way that the court proceeding works that's different from the interview is, at the interview, it's the officer asking all of the questions. When you go to court, your attorney is the one who's asking questions. The government attorney will ask some other questions. You can present your witnesses. And so it's a very different format, and it occurs in a courtroom, not in an office. So you have that master calendar hearing, and then you get scheduled for what's called an individual hearing, which is your actual asylum trial. And that's the day that your case will be done in the court and the immigration court, and you either will be approved that day or you will receive a decision in the mail. And I know attorney Labin is going to talk a little bit about appeal, so he'll talk about what happens next there. But that's basically it for that. I also want to touch on work permits for asylum seekers. President Trump, unfortunately, changed the rules on asylum-based work permits. Previously, we had to wait 180 days after you file your application for asylum, and that's the asylum clock. It's just a term that means that the time starts ticking towards when you can apply for your work permit. Now, 180 days was a really long time, and now he changed it on August 25th that asylum seekers have to wait 365 days, an entire year, to apply for a work permit, which is outrageous. And so that kind of ties back to what other speakers were talking about earlier about resources and how can you get by when you come here from your country and you have nothing with you and no connections. How are you going to survive? So this makes it even more difficult and even more important that we get connected to resources. So that's the basics of asylum. And Council Ziwa talked about VAWA a little bit. So that's another option. So if you are the spouse of a lawful permanent resident or a US citizen, and you have faced abuse, it could be psychological, emotional, verbal, physical abuse. And if you are a man or woman, it doesn't matter. Don't be fooled by the name. The Violence Against Women Act, it applies to both. Then you can apply for a special immigrant visa, the VAWA, and also ultimately a green card, either at the same time or later on, depending on if you're married to a citizen or to a permanent resident. So that's a very good option for some people. It does require some documentation. I generally have all of my clients go for psychological evaluations and write affidavits. And that reminds me to jump back to with asylum. when you're preparing your case, there's a lot of documentation that you're going to want to have. The most important is the applicant's affidavit describing all of the events that occurred and why they fear returning to their country. I send everyone for a psychological evaluation to document the trauma and its impact emotionally. If the person has any physical injuries, then I have a medical doctor document that in a report. And it also to demonstrate that you are part of the group that you say that you are. So for example, if you're saying that your asylum is based on political opinion, you want to have evidence of that political opinion, whether it's a membership card to FTC or People Power or wherever. And also, you know, your role in that group. Are you a leader in that group? Why would you specifically be targeted? And then any affidavits of anyone who has knowledge of what has happened to you. I have police reports because as you all know, a lot of Ugandans are arrested for political offenses or for LGBT or some rallies because of who they are. And so I often have the clients get the police report, the bond document, and if they had to obtain any medical treatment in Uganda, then we have, you know, from the hospital and so forth as well, documenting that. One of the things too that I failed to mention is in the immigration process, before the judge, unlike in the affirmative process in the office before the officer, you can also seek protection under the Convention Against Torture and withholding of removal. So those standards are a little bit more difficult than just asylum. And so the Convention Against Torture is you don't have to show a connection between who you are and the harm that you suffered, which is one thing that's different than the asylum, but you do have to show that it is more likely than not. So more than 50% likely that you are going to be subjected to torture by a government official or torture by someone that is condoned by a government official. So that's a much higher standard. The withholding of removal standard, you have to show a clear probability of persecution. And so that's a little bit higher, that's definitely higher than the asylum standard. So all of those three options, the asylum, removal, withholding of removal, and protection under the Convention Against Torture are all on the same application. So, but only the immigration court can make a decision about withholding of removal and Convention Against Torture. So I know that in the clients that I represent from Uganda, we see a lot of torture. And so I think that it's really important that anyone who's applying for asylum from Uganda should also be applying under CAT, Convention Against Torture, as well. And then the other one that I wanted to mention, that is an option that you probably aren't even thinking about, but there's something called a U visa, and U visa is for victims of violent crime. This is crime that has to occur in the United States. It's a very long process, but it is definitely a good thing to put in if you're eligible. The tricky thing with this is that you have to get a law enforcement officer to sign off on this before you can apply. So sometimes that's the biggest hurdle of the case, is to get that taken care of. But there's a list of qualifying crimes, and just like, for example, the one that I probably do the most is domestic violence, rape, sexual assaults, robbery. I have someone I successfully represented who was, it was an armed robbery at a convenience store. So we were able to get them a U visa based on that. So it's not just domestic violence. There are a lot of other crimes that qualify. So I know that, you know, when people come here, sometimes they're vulnerable and things happen, and it's important to keep that in mind, that if you have been a victim of a crime, to cooperate with the police, because you might be able to get an immigration benefit from that. And there's also the T visas for victims of human trafficking, but that process is somewhat similar, but a little bit different than the U visa.